James Wan, director of all the films you see here, is one of the most renowned modern horror directors and is viewed by many to be a master of the genre. So much horror gets made every year, both really good and really bad. And the type of horror that James Wan specializes in gets made all the time. In fact, I would argue that most of the horror films we get every year are attempts to emulate films like Insidious and The Conjuring, two of James Wan's most well-known movies. But we can look to the films in the Conjuring universe that James Wan didn't direct to see how unsuccessful these attempts to emulate his work often are. And I know people like to point out that James Wan's characters are more interesting and compelling than the other installments in all three of the major horror franchises he created. And while I do agree that he manages to make you care, there is one other key component that he gets right in his horror films that year after year we see so many films fall flat at. And that's that he remembers to make his horror movies scary. James Wan specializes in a more jump scare method of horror. It's a very well-known method where the button of a scene will consist of a loud sound, and oftentimes in these movies, the bad guy or the demon or whatever jumping out and grabbing a character. It's designed to make you jump, make you scream, and make your heart race for a few moments. And it often gets clowned on because of how often it is done poorly. So I'm going to play you two scenes. One directed by James Wan, and one from a film in the same universe that was not directed by James Wan. Now think about which one scares you more.
She's standing in her room.
Same type of horror, same general idea between each scene, but the one in The Nun 2 just isn't scary. Valak's arms reaching out and grabbing the kid is something we expect to happen. We're anticipating it. The way the scene is played out, the camera work, the blocking of the characters, where everyone is at, tells us that what we're gonna see is that that kid is gonna see the nun in the room. She's gonna lean back, let the other people know that the nun is just standing there, and based off where she is relative to where the camera is, we then know that the nun's arms are going to reach out and grab her. We go into this scene knowing exactly how it is going to play out from start to finish. Now contrast this to what James Wan does with the nun scene in The Conjuring 2. The scene lasts several minutes, keeping you on edge the whole time, and when the actual scare finally happens, it sticks with you more. There's a reason this scene has so many views on YouTube. There's a reason it's regarded as one of the scariest movies of all time. The movie manages to make you remember that feeling where a lot of other horror movies don't. So what's James Wan's trick? How does he manage to not only scare the audience, but leave them with a lasting sense of dread long after the movie is over? How did he manage to create not one, not two, but three of the most iconic horror franchises in the world? And how did he manage to land two of his films on the list of the scariest horror movies ever made? Well, it mainly lies in the way in which he approaches a jump scare.
I always equate horror to comedy. If a comedy is funny, you laugh at it, right? You see it straight away that it's working. If a horror is scary, you scream or you hide your faces from what's happening on screen. You set up the joke, you come in with the punchline. You set up the scares, you come in with the scare, right? The scare, whatever that is. And if your timing's off, both are not funny or scary.
And this is the approach that James Wan takes to all of his films. He never just does a jump scare out of nowhere. Take that scene I just talked about in The Conjuring 2, for example. The scene lasts almost 5 minutes, and the scare happens after this long, slow build-up, creating tension and suspense with each moment. But there's two scenes I want to look at in this video more in depth and talk about the way he builds the scare throughout the scene and eventually executes it. And they are two scenes that I believe to be masterclasses of how you should make a horror movie. And they are scenes from what I believe to be his two best films. So the first one that we are going to look at is Tiptoe Through the Tulips from Insidious. Now, I just rewatched the first Insidious for the first time in a few years, and I can confirm that this is the scariest movie ever made. Every frame of this movie is terrifying. Even the normal non-horror scenes are terrifying. This movie's vibe is just off the charts, but this scene, this goddamn scene. So the whole scene lasts 4 minutes, and it's funny that I call it the Tiptoe Through the Tulip scene because that's a very small piece of this scene. But right out of the gate, just with that info, you can see why James Wan is one of the best in the business, because he builds his scares up. He forces you to sit in this horror scene for 4 minutes. That's not a jump scare. That's just terrifying. So the scene opens with a tracking shot following Rose Byrne's character Renee as she walks down the hall and through the house. And in the background of this, a record is playing. It's playing this really calming piano piece. Keep in mind, scary things have already happened in this house, so as she's walking through it, we're seeing all these doors and all these basically voids of darkness next to her, and we're expecting something to come from one of them. But the genius of Wan using a one take here means that not only are we uneasy right out of the gate, but he has us following Renee, meaning that at all times we know where she is relative to everything else. So from the very first second of the scene, Wan removes that safety net and familiarity that we have with so many horror movies. And one of the tools with horror movies is you often look to the sides of the frame to see when something's off. But again, we're following her. So when we finally see something in that frame, it's that much scarier. The first time I watched this movie, I was home by myself on an overcast day, so it was kind of dark in my house. And when I first saw this part, it stuck with me more than any other moment in the film. The genius of how they place this kid is that he's obvious enough that you know that's not a jacket. But he's not obvious enough that you start to second guess if you were seeing things and if the movie's getting to you. Honestly, I love the camera work all throughout this scene because when James Wan isn't doing oneers, he's pulling the camera back and doing these really long shots, trying to get it as far back as possible so that as you're following the character, you know something's up, but you don't know where it's going to be coming from because, again, he's taken away that sense of familiarity that bad horror has taught us when it comes to jump scares. But so often in these shots, there isn't anything there, and you're going paranoid, looking for something that isn't there. We have not even reached the part of this scene where it actually gets scary, and as an audience, we are already terrified of what's gonna happen in the rest of it. Wan keeps us following Renee past this boy and through the house, meaning that in the same shot he appears, we leave, and he doesn't leave. So many horror movies do the thing where the camera will pan, and the person's there. And then the camera pans away. And then the camera pans back. And they're not there. That's not scary. This, however, when we leave, and the character doesn't leave, that's what's scary. And James Wan, from there, doesn't restore a false sense of hope. He doesn't try to trick us into thinking the terror is over. He ensures us that the terror has just begun. He finally decides to cut when Renee walks back the other way. A genius move for 2 reasons. One, because we need to watch her go outside for what happens next. And 2, this way we don't see the wall again. Again, the cheap trick would be to bring the camera back the same way and you see the kid's not there, but by cutting to the other side of the room, we now don't know if the kid is still there, but we do know that Renee is right next to where that kid was. Another method to a great scare, the tools in which you accomplish it, because James Wan decides to use the environment to his benefit in this scene. The record has to switch from being the piano piece to being Tiptoe Through the Tulips. And there are so many different ways that you could have the music change. You could have there be no music until the record starts playing Tiptoe Through the Tulips, letting the audience know that the vibe of this scene has changed. Could it work? Yeah, it could. And it could work very well if done right. Option 2 is you keep the piano song playing, but you make it part of the score instead of being diegetic. Diegetic means it's coming from within the actual movie. And then you have Tiptoe Through the Tulips kick in, just hard cut from that to Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Could this work? It also could, and it also could work very well if done right. But then there's option 3, and it's the option James Wan goes with, which is instead of just cutting into Tiptoe Through the Tulips, you hear the record scratch, flip, and start again. Telling the audience that someone was in the house to change it. This is where the scene gets terrifying and, in my opinion, becomes an absolute masterclass of horror. Because the terror has just begun, and we're only a minute into this 4-minute scene. When Renee finally looks back inside, we see the boy. James Wan uses the cheap disappearing in the shot trick once in this scene. Renee looks in the first window, the boy's there, pans over to the second window, boy's gone. But it makes sense in this scene because we had a build up to seeing this kid, but more importantly, the scene's not over and James Wan is assuring us that it's not over. Wan has built up this scary momentum through the first minute of the scene, and instead of cashing that in on a cheap scare, he decides to build off of that forward momentum and keep going and try to make it scarier. Bringing Renee back into the house and keeping that kid as an important player for everything else that is going to transpire in this scene. And this is where you realize that you haven't reached the scare of the scene. After the door closes, we see the kid in the background of the shot run past Renee. Again, we don't get a good look at him and he isn't messing with her, so we're scared, but for the time being, we feel some sense of safety knowing that this ghost is not targeting the character we're following. I think a reason this is clever is because previously in the movie, ghosts have been shown to be targeting people. The red one that looks like Darth Maul possessed Dalton, and then there was the ghost that walked into Renee's room earlier and went after her, which then triggered them to move. So now having a ghost that doesn't seem to be going after one of the characters is kind of more unsettling because we don't know what to expect. Again, James Wan has taken down the safety net that we think we've had, and we take what we believe horror to be, and we think we know how it works, and he flips it on its head, and we don't know what we're in for. And again, using location to your benefit, that creepy hallway that Renee walked down earlier, she now walks down again while looking for the ghost boy that's in her house. But it's different this time. We're not following her as closely anymore. We're cutting, we're moving to close-ups of her as she walks into these rooms and into these dark hallways. And all this is doing is now building up the tension of this scene. And we're seeing into this darkness, not knowing what to expect pop out of it now that we know something is in the house. We're seeing things move on their own. We're hearing sounds from all over the house. By this point in the scene, the audience is scared of pretty much every aspect of the house. But Wan wants us to focus on the background. That's why he's framing everything on the side. That's why he's using these longer shots. What he has told us thus far is that the kid is messing around in the background. That's where he wants us to look. We don't need to be scared of what's in front of Renee. We need to be scared of what's behind Renee. And it brings us into Dalton's room, and setting the rest of this scene in Dalton's room is such a smart play because we've already had so much horror that came out of Dalton's room. So we expect that that's gonna happen again, and that just ups the fear factor a little more. And Renee walks up to the dresser where she thinks the kid is at, and there's nothing there. And that's the scare. For 4 minutes, we have been on edge. We have been told for 4 minutes by James Wan that this kid is never gonna be close to our character. That our character is always gonna have some sense of safety because that kid has no intention of even being near her. And when he is, it breaks all the rules and it frightens us more. Set up the joke, execute the joke. Set up the scare, execute the scare. But if you want what is, in my opinion, the best scene of this, I think, ever. A scene that will make you crap your pants. A scene so frightening that I'm pretty sure this scene is like the sole reason James Wan is known as a master of the horror genre. I present to you Hide and Clap. I'm not bluffing when I say that this might be the scariest scene in any film on the planet. Hide and Clap is something introduced very early in the film as a game that the mom and her daughters play. It's basically Marco Polo, but on land. And to be honest with you, I don't know why anyone would ever play this. This game just sounds so inherently frightening. Hell, the very concept of hide and seek is creepy. People are hiding from you and you now have to walk through a dark house and look for them. Like, that game on its own is creepy. And then you're gonna introduce sound into that and then take away the eyes? Hell no. So how does James Wan decide to start this scene? This game of Hide and Clap is gonna be a bit scarier. Now, if I was the mom, I would do 2 things in this situation. 1, I would not go in the basement, and 2, I would move. I love the first 2 Conjuring movies, but my god, just move. And James Wan wants us to think that the demon is gonna play by the rules. Because she's already played Hide and Clap with the demon once, and it did play by the rules. But then this happens. She's stuck down there. And we're stuck down there with her. Wan then decides to do the same thing he did with Insidious, and they pull the camera back when the character gets to the bottom of the steps, allowing us to see more of the space that we're working with and giving us a sense of unease immediately that we don't know where the scare is going to be coming from. And almost immediately, my boy James decides to up the intensity by having a ball get thrown from behind something, sending Carolyn right back up the stairs. A lot of bad horror movies would treat this kind of as the scare of the scene. We've seen that 1,000 times. And you know why they would treat it as the scare of the scene? Is because it's scary. Could be scarier. Which James Wan does. James Wan has something move. Then the character reacts. But they don't get attacked. Now we're a little confused. And Carolyn runs up the stairs. And then the light goes out. So it's now dark. And then she lights a match. We should expect to see something right in front of her illuminated by that match. That's how these movies go. But this movie doesn't do that. The rules that have been established did not occur. What's supposed to happen did not happen. And now we're on edge. And James Wan takes that perfect opportunity to flip the scene a little more. Here's what we know. The way hide and clap works. Carolyn heard a clap. She then walked down to the basement, closing in on where that clap was. We also know that she has her back to the door. So nothing can be behind her except the door. And we also know that the voice asking about playing hide and clap is coming from in front of her. Put all three of these elements together, and it means something is about to be illuminated in front of her by that match. And now we're terrified. It's a very smart way of framing scares within a movie, and James Wan's comments on the similarities between horror and comedy are unbelievably accurate. You can apply the comedy template to every single one of his movies, and it becomes clear just from that why he's a master of horror. A good comedy scene goes as follows. You set up a scenario. You then call attention to that scenario by usually comedic means. You then have the character remark about it, again, usually with some comedy and some lighter jokes, as they try to solve whatever this issue is. The issue that itself is now looping back around into being funny the longer it takes. Then you have it ramp up as the character usually starts to lose their mind over whatever's happening. Work the physical and the vocal comedy together to get the audience chuckling about the absolutely insane hijinks that are ensuing in front of them. And then finally, when you've done all of that, you hit the actual punchline of the joke, and if you've set up your joke right, your audience will be in tears. Now apply this template to a scare. Set up a scenario. Call attention to that scenario in a haunting way. Have the character react to it while trying to find a solution to whatever said issue is. Have it ramp up as the character finds themselves too deep into whatever crazy thing is happening. Work the physical and the vocal fear you've built together to keep the audience on edge as this crazy thing plays out. And finally, after you've built up this tension through the scene, you deliver the final jump scare. They're the same movie, but one's funny and one's The Conjuring. And this is what makes jump scares work. This is what separates bad jump scares from the good jump scares. These don't happen out of nowhere just to get us to scream and then just go back to enjoying the movie. These are things that are built up through the scene and through the movie, questioning what we as the audience believe, making us keep our expectations in check, keep us wondering what's going to happen, make us never know that which we think we know, break the rules that you think you're establishing for us so that we're on edge the whole time, and then you hit us with an actual jump, and it's a scare. You don't even have to look at James Wan's horror movies to see how well of a master at this he is. Look at his action movies. Watch Furious 7, watch the Abu Dhabi sequence, and pay attention to how this man sets up that car driving through the buildings. So if you're ever wondering what makes a good horror movie, if you're ever wondering why 90% of the horror films you watch don't scare you, put on some James Wan films. Watch how he stages his scares, how he sets them up, how he subverts everyone's expectations, how he makes use of the space the characters are in, and think about how that all makes the final jump scare actually scary. In summary, watch James Wan.